The wind moves across the Sahel in long, deliberate strokes, bending grasslands in slow waves as though the land itself is breathing. Beneath this sky, broad and endless, Africa unfolds in its own rhythm, not hurried, not still, but alive with memory. It is a continent already full of kingdoms, cultures, calendars and connections that stretch across deserts and down rivers, long before any foreign compass turned southward. The Songhai Empire thrives along the Niger, its cities humming with scholarship and trade, its laws spoken by magistrates who quote from sacred text and live tradition alike. In Ife and Oyo, sculptors render human faces in brass and terracotta with a realism still marvelled at centuries later. In the dense forests of the Congo Basin, Bantu-speaking peoples organise vast networks of cultivation and trade, where raffia cloth passes hand to hand as both currency and art. This world is not uniform, but it is richly linked by kinship, by migration, by markets, by myths. Inland from the Swahili coast, caravans move through baobab-lined trails, their rhythms set by monsoon winds and camel steps. The settlements along this Indian Ocean frontier, Mombasa, Kilwa, Sofala, are not mere ports but city-states, thriving crossroads of Islamic scholarship, African craftsmanship, and Indian and Arabian commerce. Their mosques rise in coral stone, their calligraphy echoes across the breeze. In Great Zimbabwe, walls built without mortar still hold firm, their curved enclosures sheltering royal courts and grain stores alike. No one alive outside has yet mapped its layout, but its silence speaks of power, of memory stored in stone. To the north, the Maghreb rests on ancient foundations, the memory of Carthage, the architecture of Roman ruins, the prayers of scholars beneath the domes of Fez and Cairo. The Sahara, so often imagined as a barrier, is instead a highway. Gold from the forest zones of West Africa travels north in exchange for salt and textiles, crossing sands by caravan in journeys mapped by stars and stories. Timbuktu, already centuries old, holds shelves of manuscripts, astronomy, theology, law, penned in quiet ink by generations of scholars who walk its dusty streets. These are not imagined centres, these are real places where children recite verses beneath tamarind trees and women paint walls with symbols that mean rain, harvest, protection. Further south, in the lands later called Zambia and Zimbabwe, the Mutapa polity rises with its own logic, a kingdom governed not by iron fists but by rituals of land and ancestor, where spirits are consulted before borders are moved. Across the Horn of Africa, Aksum's legacy endures in the highlands of Ethiopia, where emperors claim descent from Solomon and Sheba. The churches carved into the earth at Lalibela rest beneath centuries of prayer, each chisel mark a form of devotion. Here, Christian liturgy is spoken in Ge'ez, an ancient tongue no longer living but never forgotten. And yet, despite the vibrant hum of life across the continent, maps drawn in Europe leave these spaces blank or monstrous. On parchment unrolled in Lisbon or Venice, Africa appears not as it is, but as a canvas for projection, labelled with dragons, forests of gold, or cryptic names invented to mask uncertainty. These maps show coasts, but not the kingdoms just inland. They name rivers, but not the peoples who drink from them. Some European travellers who do reach these shores describe marvels, but others rewrite what they see to suit the stories already told back home. This misseeing, this refusal to recognise the systems already in place, will echo through the centuries to come. Historians still debate how deliberate this erasure truly is. Did ignorance make conquest easier, or did conquest demand ignorance? Some say the absence of detailed maps reflects mere distance. Others argue it reflects something deeper, a desire not to know. To describe Africa as empty makes it easier to fill, but in the reality of that time, Africa is anything but. There are iron smelters near Lake Victoria that operate with careful ritual, their ash and slag buried in ceremonial patterns. Among the Dogon, astronomical knowledge guides both planting and prophecy. They speak of stars whose existence will only be confirmed by telescopes centuries later. Along the Congo River, oral epics preserve memories of past migrations, of warriors who walked barefoot for miles with nothing but drums and names. In the Western Cape, Khoisan rock art depicts both the animal and the spirit world, the hunt and the dream, with pigment made from earth and blood. The continent holds contradictions and continuities. It is both ancient and changing. Kingdoms war, yes, but they also trade and intermarry. Rainfall shapes settlement more than politics. Power is not only military but spiritual. An elder's whisper can carry more weight than a chief's decree. There are patterns of conflict and cooperation, but there are also long seasons of peace that do not make it into chronicles. In the marketplaces of Kano, spices and textiles pass hands beneath awnings that flutter in the midday heat. A child in a village near the Congo listens as her grandmother tells of rivers that remember, rivers that know when they have been crossed in fear. A young man in the Kalahari tracks gazelle prints in silence, his knowledge of the land so complete it cannot be written. These small moments, repeated across thousands of lives, form the heartbeat of pre-colonial Africa. And so the continent waits, not for rescue, not for discovery, but simply for another sunrise. The land does not know it is being measured from afar. It does not know that foreign ships are being readied, that kings are drafting letters, that papal bulls are being written. In this moment the rivers still run without being renamed. The mountains still stand without being claimed. The land is full of memory, of silence, of presence. In the language of one desert people, history is said to walk behind you, leaving footprints only the wise can read. Far out at sea, long before borders are broken or ports are named, a shadow appears on the horizon. It is not a storm nor a bird, but something slower, the sails of a Portuguese caravel inching down the Atlantic coast. The year is 1444, or near enough. At Cape Bojador, where sailors once believed sea monsters circled and the ocean fell away into nothing, the veil of fear begins to lift. The ship carries men hardened by conquest and blessed by kings, seeking gold, spices, and souls. They do not see the land as ancient or sacred, only open. As they move south, they mark promontories with crosses and names, leaving behind wooden markers and prayers carved into stone. These early arrivals land briefly, trade cautiously, and sail on, their records filled with marvels and mishearings. They meet Wolof traders who speak in firm tongues and wear robes dyed with indigo, and yet they write only of the gold hoops in their ears, the colour of their skin, the shape of their weapons. To these sailors, Africa is not yet a place of empires and philosophies. It is a coast to be mapped, a resource to be measured. Along the shoreline, local rulers engage with these newcomers as they have with others before, as guests, perhaps allies, perhaps rivals. In some places, trade begins almost immediately. Beads for ivory, iron for textiles. The Akan offer gold dust in calabashes. The people of the Niger Delta present kola nuts, salt and pepper. Exchanges are ritualized with ceremony and respect, but the records sent back to Europe speak of discovery, as though nothing has come before. Even now, the meaning of those first encounters remains uncertain. Some scholars suggest that African leaders saw opportunity in these visits, new partners in trade, possible buffers against rivals. Others argue the imbalance was already present, just well concealed, that these visitors came not to join, but to take. There is no consensus. The silence of unwritten voices leaves space for both truth and question. As more ships arrive, their cargo grows stranger. Not just cloth or wine, but iron shackles and painted icons, cannonballs and priests. Small chapels begin to rise on coastal hillsides, their bells chiming above forests where ancestors are buried. Portuguese outposts grow into forts. São Jorge da Mina, built in 1482, soon becomes a hub for gold and increasingly for people. Slavery is not new to the region, but the scale is shifting. In generations past, those enslaved were captives from war, absorbed into households or traded in regional markets. Now, foreign demand transforms the practice into a system, and the coast itself into a corridor of departure. The men who once traded cola and cloth begin to weigh the value of human cargo, their choices shaped by pressure and temptation in equal measure. The rhythms of life shift, villages relocate, raids increase, trust frays along rivers that once carried only traders and griots. Still, inland life endures. In the highlands and savannas, many communities remain untouched by these arrivals. A grandmother in the Bearmender grassfield still weaves raffia with the same patterns her mother did. In the forests of Angola, hunters follow elephant trails, listening for signs in the hush between bird calls. But in time, even those far from the coast begin to feel the change. The need for captives fuels conflict, and conflict reshapes kinship. Local leaders forge new alliances, some with each other, some with the foreigners. Iron tools become more common, but so do firearms. It becomes harder to tell which path is chosen and which is coerced. A prince may resist 1 year and trade the next. A village may welcome missionaries, then drive them out. There is no single story. There are only fragments. Oral memories, Portuguese logs, carved symbols left on stones. And together they speak of an encounter that deepens with every tide. On the island of São Tomé, sugar plantations rise, built with African labour in European design. It becomes a template, a quiet rehearsal for the transatlantic systems yet to come. The soil is rich, the work is brutal, and the rewards are sent elsewhere. Meanwhile, Jesuit missionaries write letters filled with hopeful conversions and bitter lamentations. Some write of African kings who accept baptism and request tutors for their sons. Others complain that the people hear the gospel but keep their drums. There is a quiet irony in the way faith is shared, not through understanding, but through hierarchy, assumption and translation layered with error. Still, among both Africans and Europeans, there are those who genuinely seek to learn. A Congo nobleman writes to the Portuguese king asking for books, not weapons. A priest learns Kikongo and translates prayers into local cadence. These moments are rare, but they matter, like lanterns flickering at sea. On maps drawn in Lisbon, the African coast begins to fill with names: Cabo Verde, Serra Leoa, Guinea. The interior remains blank, marked only by conjecture and myth. Yet even as European presence grows, it is still coastal, still dependent on African intermediaries. Ships wait offshore, goods are exchanged through negotiated channels. The balance, though uneven, still leans on African terms. Inland kingdoms remain strong. In Benin, the Oba maintains a court of extraordinary refinement, where ivory carvings depict leopards and ancestors with delicate precision. The kingdom resists missionary encroachment, trading only what it chooses. Its walls stretch for miles, its bureaucracy rivals that of any European capital. In Mali, oral historians still trace lineage back to Sundiata. In Ethiopia, monks continue to chant in stone churches shaded by juniper trees. Yet even now changes begin to press forward. Languages blend on the coast. Children grow up hearing both Kikongo and Portuguese. A man might wear a crucifix and still pour libations to ancestral spirits. Cultural syncretism unfolds not as rebellion, but as survival. There is no sharp line between old and new, only layers of change. A calabash might hold holy water, a proverb might reference a ship's mast, and still the caravels come, their sails now a common sight, their flags recognised by fishermen and traders alike. These ships do not yet rule, but they have arrived, and with them begins the slow erosion of an older rhythm. Not a storm, not a conquest, not yet. But the tide has shifted. Along the palm-fringed shores of West Africa, where tides still wash over the footprints of early traders, a deeper shadow settles, not of ships alone, but of something more enduring. The Atlantic slave trade expands in quiet increments, spreading like a stain that moves not with speed, but with certainty. In the decades that follow the first arrivals, the business of human trafficking becomes the central artery connecting Africa to the rising economies of Europe and the Americas. The traffic is not constant but rhythmic, determined by seasons, wars and alliances, yet its impact is relentless. Communities near the coast become enmeshed in its machinery, some willingly, others by force, some drifting gradually into it, as a fisherman drifts downstream until the river becomes a flood. The castles built by the Portuguese are soon claimed or matched by the Dutch, the British, the French. Stone by stone, forts rise along the Gold Coast, Elmina, Cape Coast, Gorée, their thick walls built not to withstand sieges, but to store bodies. Beneath their foundations lie dungeons where air is thick, light is scarce, and names are forgotten. Each year, tens of thousands are taken. Men, women, and children marched from interior regions, sold by rival groups, or captured in raids that strip entire villages from the landscape. The trade reshapes patterns of warfare, erodes systems of justice, and shifts the balance of power across entire regions. It is not that slavery is unknown on the continent. It has long existed in forms rooted in social structures, kinship, and rehabilitation. But now, with external demand so vast and profit so disproportionate, captivity becomes commodified in new and brutal ways. In Dahomey, a powerful kingdom rises through military strength and participation in the trade, its regiments of women warriors celebrated in legend but also implicated in supply. In Senegambia, elders debate whether trade with the Europeans brings prosperity or devastation. The arguments are not simple. Some rulers grow wealthy and build palaces with imported tiles and brass fittings. Others witness the disappearance of entire generations, and still the ships come. On board, the middle passage begins, crammed below deck in silence broken only by chains and sea spray. Captives endure a journey shaped by fear and disease. Those who survive do so with scars that stretch across lifetimes. Yet the trauma begins long before the ocean. It begins in forests where families are torn apart, in markets where human beings are inspected like grain. The trauma echoes even in those left behind. A mother who has lost her son does not know whether to mourn or to hope. A chief who once held power over his land now finds that the weapons he accepted in trade have also armed his rivals. A child grows up in a village where entire lineages have vanished and learns not to speak their names. In quiet corners of the continent, resistance simmers. Some communities retreat inland, avoiding coastal roads entirely. Others sabotage trade routes or protect fugitives with codes known only to the initiated. Oral traditions develop new songs, sorrow songs, warning songs, lullabies with double meanings. Some speak of a time when the rivers will return those taken, Others describe the ships as monsters, devourers of people. Among the Akan, it is said that the spirits of those who die at sea cannot return home. Shrines appear near the shore to honour the lost. These gestures may seem small, but they are acts of memory, of refusal to forget. Scholars still debate how much local societies understood the full extent of the trade's consequences. Some argue that leaders were misled, that they did not grasp the permanence of the loss. Others believe the knowledge was present, but eclipsed by desperation or strategic necessity. The truth may lie in between, in the ambiguity of half choices made under duress. Yet even as the trade flourishes, Africa does not fall silent. Agricultural cycles continue. Kingdoms still rise and govern with complexity. Children still laugh in courtyards, and markets still buzz with the exchange of yams, salt, and gossip. The daily fabric of life stretches to absorb the pain, but it does not unravel completely. In the Congo, Christian faith blends with traditional belief in a fusion that defies categorization. A crucifix may hang beside an ancestral altar. A liturgy may include drum beats. This is not syncretism by accident. It is adaptation as resilience. In the Sahel, Fulani herders follow grazing routes traced by generations, their lives bound more to cattle than to empire. In Madagascar, the Merina kingdom consolidates power inland, building a state structure that rivals any on the mainland. These histories run parallel to the slave trade, not beneath it. They are not erased by it, though they are shaped and scarred. Along the rivers, subtle changes mark the intrusion of the new systems. Cloth woven in India arrives via European ships and displaces local dyes. Cowries once traded as currency now flood inland in volumes that unbalance entire economies. Guns become both tool and threat, their presence shifting political calculations. The landscape itself begins to alter. Forests near forts grow thin from the constant traffic. Paths widen into roads, and still the ships come. Some are sleek slavers flying Dutch flags. Others are armed French vessels carrying Jesuits and trade goods. Each carries more than cargo. They bring news of the Americas, of sugar plantations in Brazil, of rebellions in the Caribbean. Sometimes, Africans who were once enslaved return, changed by their journeys, their identities blurred across oceans. In Sierra Leone and Liberia, settlements begin to rise where freed people return from the Americas, bringing English tongues, Christian prayer, and memories too jagged to speak aloud. These returnees are not always welcomed. Tensions grow between them and local populations, yet even these frictions are part of a larger rhythm, the shuffling of people, identities, and grief across continents. The Atlantic slave trade, though vast, is not eternal. It will rise, peak, and decline over the coming centuries, but its legacy settles into the soil. It redraws lines, breaks kinships, and lingers in memory like a storm that never fully passes. A proverb from the forest zone says, "The tree that forgets its root will fall." Across the continent, memory becomes a kind of resistance, not loud, but enduring. A drumbeat echoes the footfall of those taken. A name passed down across generations holds more than identity. It holds survival. And the coastline, once a corridor of ancient trade, now carries two memories, one of exchange, the other of loss. Inland from the salt-streaked coasts and the weathered doors of slave forts, a different kind of visitor begins to arrive. Not a trader, not a soldier, but a traveller with notebook in hand and scripture in mind. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, missionaries and explorers set their sights on the interior of Africa, driven by curiosity, piety, or empire's promise. Some come alone, others under the banner of missionary societies or imperial offices. bearing gifts, maps, and a quiet sense of certainty. They write of Africa as if seeing it for the first time, despite the deep histories beneath their feet. Their journals record winding rivers, imposing mountains, and unfamiliar customs with equal awe and judgment. They misname towns and kingdoms, struggle with languages, and often misinterpret the rituals they observe. Yet their presence marks a new phase in the growing entanglement between Europe and Africa, no longer coastal and occasional, but systematic and inland. Their journeys are slow and uncertain. Tsetse flies kill horses, fever breaks their stride, guides desert them. But slowly over decades, paths are carved across landscapes once known only to local traders and kings. In the highlands of present-day Malawi, Scottish missionary David Livingstone walks through fields of millet and ash, recording impressions and offering sermons to any who will listen. He sees slavery in the Arab trade routes of East Africa and dreams of a threefold mission: Christianity, commerce, and civilization. To many back in Britain, he becomes a hero, a man of letters and lantern, bringing light to a so-called dark continent. But on the ground, reactions to men like him are mixed. Some communities welcome them, hoping for protection or medicine or trade. Others view them with suspicion, puzzled by their refusal to honour local spirits, their awkward grasp of custom, their insistent prayers. Livingstone himself is both witness and agent, horrified by the brutality of slavery, yet convinced that the solution lies not in African autonomy, but in European oversight. He calls for the opening of the interior, for new routes and railways that, in time, will invite more than missionaries. Along the Niger, explorers like Mungo Park sail upstream in small boats, meeting kings who offer tribute and hospitality, and others who bar their passage entirely. Many do not return. Disease, drowning, and resistance claim their lives, their journals retrieved later from among their belongings, published back home as triumphs of courage and curiosity. These writings shape European perception of the continent, a place of danger, potential, and spiritual need. But they also erase. They focus on rivers, but not on the people who navigate them. They describe landscapes, but not the stories rooted within them. In many of these accounts, African agency disappears, replaced by the observer's gaze. And yet, the observers are not untouched. Some arrive with firm beliefs and leave with softened edges, moved by hospitality or struck by contradiction. A missionary might decry ancestor veneration, but attend a funeral and feel, if only briefly, the weight of history in the air. Back in Europe, the information gathered by these travellers is mapped, debated, and displayed. Drawing rooms in Paris and London host exhibitions of beads, spears, and carved stools, labelled without names, interpreted without context. Ethnographic sketches appear in newspapers beside stories of danger and deliverance. The continent becomes a curiosity cabinet, its complexity reduced to types and trophies. Still, the work of mapping continues. Rivers are charted in loops and bends. Mountain ranges are named, often after monarchs who have never set foot there. The interior, once labelled unknown, is now a jigsaw puzzle slowly being assembled from observation, supposition, and ambition. One by one, gaps are filled, not with African voices but with European labels. Yet Africa does not stand still. Even as these outsiders move through its forests and valleys, its own intellectual and spiritual currents flow. In the Ethiopian highlands, monasteries still copy ancient texts by hand, their monks more familiar with the Gospels than many of the missionaries who arrive. In the Islamic centres of Kano, Sokoto, and Timbuktu, scholars continue to teach law, astronomy, and logic in Arabic, their libraries filled with manuscripts on philosophy and theology. Among the Xhosa in the south, prophets and diviners interpret dreams and signs with a depth of meaning lost on colonial linguists. When the missionaries speak of God, they are not always introducing a new idea. They are entering into a conversation already centuries old. Some missionaries learn local languages, translate the Bible into Kiswahili, Yoruba, or Setswana. Their translations, though imperfect, become tools of both conversion and resistance. A child may read scripture at night by candlelight, and years later use that same literacy to organize protest. A village elder may attend a church service and still visit the shrine of his ancestors. These overlaps create new forms of expression. Hymns are sung with drum beats. Churches are built with thatch and carved doors. Faith becomes both foreign and familiar. At times, these overlaps deepen into conflict. The arrival of missionaries often undermines traditional authorities, labeling local beliefs as superstition. In some places, ancestral masks are burned. In others, temples are dismantled. But resistance persists, not in open revolt, but in the quiet persistence of practice. A ritual performed at dawn, a proverb whispered at the right moment. Scholars still debate the intentions and impacts of these early missionaries and explorers. Were they precursors to empire, softening the ground for conquest? Or were they, in some cases, unwitting witnesses to processes larger than themselves? Some argue they believed in the moral power of their message, blind to its implications. Others suggest that their writings, however sincere, served to justify the expansion of foreign rule. What is certain is that their presence marks a turning point. The world is no longer distant. Africa's rivers and roads are now inscribed in foreign atlases. Its people are now the subjects of foreign prayers, foreign laws, foreign plans. The spiritual terrain is shifting. The land remembers its rhythms, but new sounds now echo in its valleys. A church bell rings beside a shrine. A letter is written in both Latin and Arabic script. And somewhere, in a village not marked on any map, a child listens to two stories, one from a preacher, one from a grandmother, and begins to carry both. In a quiet hall in Berlin, far from the dust and sun of African plains, a group of European men sit around a table thick with maps, treaties, and ambition. It is the winter of 1884, and the conference has been called not by an African sovereign or scholar, but by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Outside, snow gathers on stone windowsills. Inside, borders are drawn in ink. 14 nations attend: Germany, Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, and others. But no African representative is invited. The purpose is clear, though it is cloaked in the language of commerce and civilization, to avoid conflict among Europeans by organizing their seizure of Africa. Over months of negotiation, rules are set. A European claim to African territory will only be recognized if it is effectively occupied, though what counts as effective is left deliberately vague. Rivers are designated as free routes for trade, yet the voices of those who live along their banks are nowhere heard. The continent is partitioned not by its own histories, but by European convenience. Straight lines cut through kingdoms, mountains and rivers, as though geography and culture were details to be tidied later. The Berlin Conference does not begin Africa's colonization, but it accelerates it. What had been a gradual, uneven intrusion along coasts now becomes a coordinated rush inland, a scramble. Over the following decades, European powers move quickly to secure what they have claimed on paper. Treaties are signed under pressure or misunderstanding. Flags are raised where none had flown before. In many places, African leaders attempt to negotiate, believing they are engaging in diplomacy among equals. They offer tribute, host envoys, and ask questions that are never answered. Some treaties are said to protect sovereignty while fostering trade, but contain hidden clauses ceding full control. One quiet debate among historians lingers around the so-called Treaty of Wuchale, signed between Italy and Ethiopia in 1889. The Italian version suggests Ethiopia becomes a protectorate. The Amharic version does not. The disagreement will lead to war. But in the rooms of Berlin, these complexities are invisible. The men draw their lines and return to their capitals satisfied. The irony is thick. While Europe prides itself on diplomacy and law, its decisions here are made without witness, consent, or context. Lands with long histories of governance, culture, and belief are treated as vacant. Tabula rasa for empire. The phrase terra nullius lingers in the margins of legal thought, applied in spirit if not by name. Even regions that Europeans had not entered, dense forests, vast deserts, highland kingdoms, are claimed with confidence. The logic is simple. What is not controlled by Europe must be brought under control. The justifications vary. Some speak of ending slavery, others speak of spreading religion, still others of commerce and infrastructure. But beneath these motives lies something deeper, the belief that the continent must be ordered by European hands. Across Africa, the ripple effects begin. In Lagos, rumours spread of British expansion beyond the coast. In the Congo Basin, agents of King Leopold II of Belgium begin signing treaties and planting flags, often with violence or deceit. In French West Africa, expeditions are launched to map and claim territory with rapid precision. Colonial administrators, missionaries, and soldiers follow paths opened by earlier explorers, now armed not just with Bibles and notebooks, but with weapons, law books, and currency. What was drawn in Berlin must now be made real on the ground. And still, Africa endures. In the Sudan, the Mahdist uprising challenges foreign influence with fierce conviction. In Ashanti territory, golden stools are hidden and oaths are sworn to resist. Across regions, messages pass between leaders. Some seek alliances with one European power to fend off another. Some prepare for war. Others try to wait, hoping the newcomers will leave as quickly as they came. Few anticipate how long the new era will last, or how deeply it will change the land. A quiet sorrow lies in the simplicity of the map that emerges. Borders run straight where rivers curve. Nations are split. Rivals are joined. Sacred sites fall on opposite sides of arbitrary lines. What had once been fluid, migration, trade, language, is now interrupted by customs posts and checkpoints. Even today, the legacy of those lines shapes politics and conflict. But at the time, there is little time for reflection. The pace is too quick. The conference ends and the scramble begins. European newspapers publish optimistic sketches of Africa, lands of promise, of minerals and railways and soil waiting to be tilled. Little is said of the people who live there. When they are mentioned, they are reduced to types: noble savages, childlike wards, dangerous tribes. This flattening of identity becomes a tool of empire. If a people are simplified, they are easier to manage. If a land is deemed empty, it is easier to claim. Some colonial officers will later admit they knew little of the societies they governed. They learned only what was useful, the rest was ignored. Still, the land does not forget itself. In Ethiopia, emperors keep court with ancient ceremony, maintaining a calendar untouched by European clocks. In the Sahara, Tuareg caravans continue their migrations, tracing routes that predate any treaty. In the forests of the Congo, villages sing songs that mark time in moons, not months. Life continues, not untouched, but not fully broken. A proverb from the East says, "When elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers." In the wake of the Berlin Conference, it is not only the grass, but the soil itself, the memory of ancestors, the rhythms of seasons, the flow of trade, the meaning of place, that begins to bend under the weight of distant decisions. The scramble begins not with thunder, but with footsteps, boots on sand, hooves in dust, ships anchoring off river mouths, men with pens and rifles moving inland in measured columns. What was once a line drawn in a Berlin hall becomes a road cut through forest, a treaty delivered beneath the shade of a tree, a fortress erected beside a village square. Across the continent, European powers move to occupy what they have claimed. The British press inland from coastal colonies in West Africa and Southern Africa. The French extend their grip across the Sahel, from Senegal toward Lake Chad. The Germans appear in Cameroon, Tanganyika and Namibia with engineers and gunboats, though their presence is less expected. The Belgians spread silently and cruelly through the Congo, under the private rule of King Leopold II, whose ambition cloaks itself in philanthropy, but unfolds in forced labour, amputations and quotas measured in baskets of severed hands. The Portuguese and Italians stake claims of their own, driven by echoes of earlier empire. Everywhere flags are planted and oaths are extracted, often with little comprehension on either side. Some agreements are sealed with gifts and handshakes, others are enforced with violence. In many regions, resistance comes first not as open war, but as delay, diplomacy, or negotiation. African leaders, well versed in local alliance building, treat the new arrivals as another set of actors in a long history of trade and encounter. Letters are written, emissaries received. Some leaders sign treaties they believe will guarantee peace or preserve autonomy, only to find the fine print denies both. The chiefs of the Shona offer hospitality, only to be declared subjects. The rulers of Buganda enter into protectorate agreements that soon shift into tighter control. In the Delta, Jaja of Opobo is invited aboard a British ship and quietly exiled. What appears peaceful on the surface masks deeper shifts in authority. Even where violence is avoided, power begins to flow in new directions, toward district officers, military governors, trading companies. The machinery of conquest tightens without the need for battle, though battles still come. In the savannas of West Africa, Samori Touré leads an army of resistance against French expansion, organising his forces with discipline drawn from Islamic reformist traditions and regional military networks. His campaigns stretch across a decade, slowing the French advance and reshaping the geography of war. In the south, the Ashanti fight 4 wars with the British, each more desperate than the last, until the capital of Kumasi is burned and the golden stool hidden from colonial eyes. In what will become Zimbabwe, the Ndebele rise against settler incursion, armed with spears, muskets, and memory. The Matabele War is brief, but its wounds are deep. To the east, Menelik Thisu of Ethiopia defeats an Italian army at Adwa in 1896, using diplomacy, arms from abroad, and a united front of Ethiopian nobles. His victory stands alone in the era, a rare and celebrated success in halting European domination through force. It sends a ripple across the continent, a whisper that not all outcomes are inevitable. Still, for most, conquest proceeds. It is not always fast, nor always smooth, but it is steady. Infrastructure follows soldiers. Railways are laid to connect inland resources to coastal ports. Telegraph wires string across plains. Forts are replaced with administrative posts. Where resistance is fierce, punitive expeditions are sent. Villages are burned, crops seized, leaders imprisoned. Some are hanged in public squares, others are exiled to far islands. the cost of resistance becomes generational. In German Southwest Africa, the Herero and Nama peoples rise against expropriation and forced labour. The German response is brutal, a campaign of extermination that drives thousands into the desert to die. Survivors are held in camps, their population decimated. Decades later, this will be named genocide. At the time, it is a warning. The empire once abstract now wears a uniform. The new rulers do not arrive as a single force, but as many faces, soldiers in pressed uniforms, missionaries in white robes, traders with ledgers, surveyors with compasses. Together they carry maps, laws, guns, and unfamiliar languages. They build fences, schools, prisons, and churches. They name mountains and lakes already known by other names. They redraw clan territories into districts, break lineage systems with taxes and titles, and enforce labour policies with papers and patrols. The colonial project is not only military, it is bureaucratic. Registers are created, identities recorded, ethnicities labelled and ranked. In some regions, indirect rule is favoured. Local chiefs are appointed or co-opted to enforce colonial law. In others, direct administration replaces all traditional authority. The strategy depends on the territory, the resistance, and the preference of the colonizer. A quiet debate still persists over whether African societies collapsed quickly under pressure or adapted subtly, resisting in ways not always visible. Some argue that collaboration and resistance were not opposites but overlapping strategies. A leader might resist militarily in one year and accept colonial office the next. A village might pay taxes but continue to perform banned rituals in secret. There are no pure roles, only survival, and survival often demands silence, flexibility, or the appearance of obedience. A quiet irony lies in how the colonizers, seeking order and classification, often fail to see the layers of ambiguity beneath the surface. In the markets, life adjusts. New currencies replace cowries. Imported textiles compete with local weaving. Crops shift. Cotton, cocoa, coffee, groundnuts, all chosen for export, not sustenance. The landscape changes with it. Forests are cleared for plantations. Rivers are dammed. Roads cut through ancestral groves. Some elders wonder if the land still listens to their prayers. Others adapt, planting the required crops by day and tending sacred fields by night. And still, the people remember. A child learns both the colonial anthem and the song of her grandmother's birth. A court scribe writes in Arabic and in French. A trader pays tax in silver, but negotiates dowries in goats. The world becomes layered, not erased. Beneath the flags and proclamations, the soil still holds the weight of older truths. In the silence between gunshots, the drums still speak. Softly now, but with memory. The resistance does not end when the flags are raised or when the treaties are enforced. It mutates, survives, finds new rhythms. Across the continent, beneath the surface of new colonial orders, the pushback against foreign rule continues, sometimes open, often quiet, always rooted in memory. In some places, it takes the form of armed uprisings, led by warriors and kings, prophets and farmers. In others, it flows through spiritual renewal, ritual defiance, or strategic evasion. In the forests of West Africa, the Baibure Rebellion of 1898 erupts in Sierra Leone against British-imposed hut taxes, an administrative imposition that feels both intrusive and senseless. Baibure, a respected ruler and warrior, uses guerrilla tactics, drawing on intimate knowledge of terrain and local support. The British respond with overwhelming force, burning villages and capturing him. but the rebellion leaves a mark, showing that even indirect rule is not always enough to pacify. In the savannas of today's Sudan, a more sweeping revolt has already unfolded. In 1881, Muhammad Ahmad declares himself the Mahdi, the guided one, and unites diverse communities against the Turco-Egyptian administration backed by the British. His movement combines religious fervour, political vision, and a deep frustration with foreign interference. Khartoum falls in 1885, and the Mahdist state rules for over a decade before being crushed in 1898. Its legacy is complex, both a theocratic regime and a fierce assertion of local sovereignty, remembered with both reverence and critique. In the south, the Nandi of Kenya resist British advance under Koitalel Arap Samoei, refusing the intrusion of railways, taxes and foreign courts. His assassination under a flag of truce in 1905 shocks his followers, and while the resistance collapses soon after, the memory of betrayal lingers for generations. Elsewhere, resistance weaves into prophecy. In southern Africa, the Xhosa cattle-killing movement of the 1850s becomes one of the most haunting episodes of colonial-era spiritual defiance. After years of conflict and encroachment, a young prophetess named Nonkawus claims that if the Yoruba destroy their cattle and grain, the physical symbols of their old world, the ancestors will rise, the settlers will vanish, and the land will be restored. Thousands believe, the slaughter spreads, and famine follows. Over 300,000 cattle are killed. As the people starve, colonial authorities solidify control over the region. Some scholars see the event as tragic delusion. Others read it as a profound act of resistance, rooted in grief, desperation, and hope. Even in failure, it reshapes the landscape, both physical and psychological. In German East Africa, rebellion takes on a new form in 1905 with the Maji Maji uprising, a multi-ethnic movement against forced cotton cultivation. The colonial regime demands quotas that disrupt local food production and traditions. A spiritual leader named Kinjekitile claims to have received sacred water, Maji, that will turn German bullets to dust. Armed with this belief, tens of thousands rise up. The response is brutal. Villages are scorched, crops destroyed, wells poisoned. Up to 300,000 die, not only in battle but from famine engineered to punish. The Germans learn that military victory does not always yield peace. The land remembers. The people do not forget. Not all resistance is martial. Some is woven into the everyday. In towns and villages, stories are told that mock colonial officials. Songs are sung that carry coded meanings. Women pass on dances and names that colonial schools attempt to erase. Children attend mission classes by day and sit by firelight at night learning genealogies that stretch back to creation. There are court systems that operate in parallel, one colonial with paper and stamps, and another older one with elders and proverb. In the marketplaces, resistance takes the form of refusal, not planting cash crops, not registering for taxes, not speaking the colonial language unless necessary. These actions are not always dramatic, but they accumulate. They preserve dignity in the face of domination. The colonial powers struggle to understand the depth and breadth of this resistance. Reports from the field describe uncooperative tribes, backward customs, sullen labour. Few administrators grasp the subtlety of resistance that does not wear a uniform or carry a flag. Some believe that education will produce loyalty. Others push for tighter control. Across the continent, colonial schools begin to appear, often staffed by missionaries, sometimes by civil servants. The curriculum is designed not to inspire independence, but to train clerks, translators, and docile subjects. European history is emphasized, African history ignored or distorted. Christian values are taught alongside basic literacy. Yet even here, resistance forms. A student who learns to read can also write petitions, letters, newspapers. A young girl who reads scripture may also question authority. Some graduates become loyal servants of empire. Others become its fiercest critics. One quiet irony lies in how the very tools of colonial control, printing presses, roads, standardized language, become instruments of future rebellion. Resistance learns to speak the language of law, of protest, of publication. But for now, it remains scattered. No Pan-African movement unites the uprisings. Each is rooted in local grievance shaped by local memory, and still they rise. In the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia remains a sovereign beacon. After its victory at Adwa, the country becomes a symbol across the continent. Newspapers in Lagos, Accra, and Dakar celebrate its independence. Soldiers and students alike speak of Ethiopia not just as a place, but as an idea, that African sovereignty is possible, that colonial rule is not destiny. Elsewhere, this hope takes quieter forms, a carved mask hidden from colonial eyes, a shrine rebuilt after it is torn down, a field planted with crops banned by the authorities. In each gesture lies a refusal, not always loud, but enduring. Colonial administrators report that peace has been restored, or that order has been established, but beneath their statements lies unease. They sense, though rarely admit, that their control is incomplete. The landscape bears scars, charred earth, graves without markers, treaties signed in duress, but also signs of endurance. A village once burned is rebuilt. A lineage once silenced is recalled in whispered song. And across the continent the ground shifts quietly under the weight of imposed rule, waiting, remembering, preparing. In the years that follow conquest, the machinery of empire sets itself to work, not with the noise of war, but with the steady hum of bureaucracy, road building, paperwork, and quiet extraction. Colonial administrations settle into their routines, each empire crafting its own style of governance, but all guided by the same logic to make Africa legible, manageable, profitable. In British colonies, indirect rule becomes the favoured method, especially in regions like Nigeria and northern Rhodesia, where existing chiefs and emirs are co-opted into governing on behalf of the crown. The system appears efficient, even respectful of local tradition, but beneath its surface lies a reordering of authority. Chiefs once chosen by consensus are now appointed by administrators. Customary law is rewritten to fit colonial categories. Power flows not from ancestors or councils, but from colonial offices with letterhead stamped in distant cities. In French West Africa and Equatorial Africa, direct rule dominates. Governors oversee a hierarchy of command, with little room for local autonomy. French language, French law, French ideals of civilization are imposed as a universal standard, and in return colonial subjects are expected to obey, serve, and assimilate. In theory, this offers the promise of eventual equality. In practice, it demands silence and conformity. In the Belgian Congo, the administration is dense and paternalistic, run with a cold efficiency that leaves no space for dissent. A vast network of agents, companies, missionaries, and forced labour quotas ensures the smooth flow of rubber and minerals. Punishments are swift. Surveillance is constant. In German colonies, order is prized above all. Rebellions are crushed, labour is compulsory, and language is policy. Each system may differ in tone, but their effects converge. Across the continent, new institutions take root. Schools, prisons, railways, courts. Colonial capitals are laid out in grids, their streets named for kings, generals, or distant rivers. Outside these centres of control lie villages and fields where life continues, though altered by the demands of empire. Taxes must be paid, sometimes in cash, sometimes in labour. Men leave their homes for months to build roads, harvest rubber, or carry goods for colonial campaigns. In some places, women are conscripted to grow cotton or gather firewood for government posts. Children are enrolled in mission schools where they recite lessons about distant monarchs, chant hymns in new languages, and are taught to forget the stories their grandmothers once whispered at dusk. The physical infrastructure of empire expands rapidly. Railways are pushed through jungles and over plains, not to connect communities, but to link mines to ports, plantations to warehouses. Telegraph lines follow, binding administrative centres in a web of command. Roads appear where none existed before, straight, narrow, and lined with milestones marking distances not in kinship, but in kilometres. The built environment serves control, not comfort. Hospitals treat workers to keep them labouring. Police stations are built before libraries. The priorities of rule are visible in the architecture itself. Beneath this surface lies a dense and growing archive. Colonial officers keep detailed records, census reports, tax rolls, maps, legal codes. Names are recorded, ethnicities classified, languages catalogued. These efforts to categorize and quantify often distort the complexity they seek to manage. People who once identified by clan, lineage, or region are now assigned to fixed ethnic groups, each with a supposed temperament, talent, and social place. These labels, once inscribed in files and policies, begin to shape self-perception. The simplification of identity becomes a tool of governance, easier to divide, easier to rule. One quiet debate continues among historians, whether these colonial constructions of ethnicity were entirely invented or merely hardened existing boundaries. The answer is layered, as with much else, a mix of imposition, misunderstanding, and local adaptation. Economic policies deepen imperial control. Cash crop economies are encouraged or enforced. In Ghana, cocoa becomes king. In Senegal, peanuts dominate. In Uganda, cotton fields replace subsistence plots. These shifts alter both diet and dependency. Food shortages emerge in areas once self-sufficient. Markets now follow global prices. A drought in one region and a price drop in London can ripple across entire communities. Colonial economies are extractive by design. The profits flow outward. Roads and rails do not loop inward for local trade but stretch like arteries to the sea. Labour becomes a central point of tension. Forced labour is common despite the language of progress. Men are conscripted for road work, mining, construction. In the Congo, quotas are enforced with whips and jail cells. In Madagascar, the French demand tens of thousands build roads with their bare hands. In Kenya, settler plantations require cheap labour, leading to past systems and land alienation that force African families into dependency. In mining zones like Katanga or the Rand, vast labour compounds are built, segregated and monitored. Workers live in barracks, their movements controlled, their lives organised around the rhythms of extraction. Still, even within these harsh systems, strategies of endurance emerge. Some refuse to register for labour, others feign illness, flee into forests or send substitutes. Songs circulate with lyrics that mock colonial officers. Prayers blend Christian verses with ancestral invocations. Resistance is rarely open, but always present. A field is planted with the wrong crop. A name is withheld during census. A proverb is repeated just loudly enough to be heard. The colonial machine depends on knowledge, but it is often knowledge gathered without consent or context. Anthropologists, missionaries, and administrators all collect words, customs, rituals, filing them into books and exhibits. In Europe, museums display masks, weapons, and bones under glass, removed from the worlds that gave them meaning. In Africa, the keepers of those meanings continue quietly. A healer passes on recipes in coded chants. A sculptor teaches his son to carve the forbidden shapes in secret. A woman prepares a meal using herbs whose names are no longer taught in school, but still spoken in kitchens. Colonial governance strives for order, but never fully achieves it. Famine breaks out in regions where forced labour has disrupted planting. Epidemics spread where displacement and confinement weaken immunity. Famously, in German-controlled East Africa, the rinderpest virus decimates cattle herds, leading to hunger and despair. In some areas, locusts arrive, stripping the fields bare. The colonizers respond with statistics and surveys, but rarely with solutions that serve the people most affected. In moments of crisis, the promises of progress ring hollow, and still, life goes on. Children grow up learning both the language of empire and the language of their elders. A boy memorizes the catechism by day and dances to the drum at night. A woman weaves cloth with patterns passed down for generations, even as factory-made fabric floods the market. A traveller boards a colonial train but carries charms tied to his wrist for protection. In these moments, survival is not surrender, and continuity does not mean consent. The empire governs with files and fences, but the people live through memory, through song, through the quiet refusal to forget who they were before the machine arrived. Beneath the quiet rhythm of empire, daily life in colonial Africa unfolds in patterns shaped by adaptation, endurance, and subtle negotiation. The rules of foreign rule are clear. Taxes are due, permits required, labour demanded, but between these imposed structures lie countless moments of continuity, improvisation, and quiet refusal. In cities and villages alike, people wake before dawn, just as they always have, to light fires, fetch water, tend livestock, and prepare food. A colonial flag may fly from the district office, but it does not rise with the sun or bring rain to the fields. In kitchens, women grind maize and millet, their hands remembering movements older than colonial borders. Children carry baskets and calabashes to market, navigating alleyways named after governors they have never met. In mission schools, students read French, English, or Portuguese aloud, mispronouncing foreign words but mastering the tone, knowing that literacy opens doors, not always to freedom, but sometimes to lesser hardship. Markets pulse with their own logic. Traders haggle over spices, cloth, and produce, blending currencies and languages as needed. Colonial coins exchange hands alongside beads, salt, and barter. News spreads faster than official notices. A birth, a death, a new tax decree, all carried through whispers, songs, and rumour. In some regions, colonial officers try to enforce price controls or restrict certain goods, but enforcement is uneven. A colonial policeman might turn a blind eye in exchange for a meal or a small gift. Authority in practice is inconsistent, and people learn where the seams are. In the compounds of colonial capitals, clerks and messengers dress in pressed uniforms and carry documents from one desk to another. They translate orders from governors into the local idiom and pass back petitions laced with polite resistance. Some of these men are deeply loyal to the administration. Others see themselves as mediators, performing obedience while quietly shielding their communities from harsher demands. Religion becomes a space of complexity. In churches built by missionaries, the pews fill on Sundays with worshippers who wear both crucifixes and ancestral beads. The sermon might be in Latin, but the prayers afterward are whispered in older tongues. Conversion is not always a break from tradition, but a layering. Some adopt Christianity fully, Others incorporate its elements into existing spiritual frameworks. New religious movements also arise, syncretic faiths that blend Christian scripture with African cosmology, offering healing, prophecy, and resistance. In colonial eyes, these are often dismissed as heretical or dangerous. To their followers, they are lifelines, spiritual maps in an unfamiliar world. The rhythms of time itself begin to shift. Where once life followed the cycles of planting, harvest, and festival, now weeks are marked by work schedules and school terms. Calendars are printed with imperial holidays, unfamiliar saints' days, and coronation anniversaries. Yet in private, families still gather to mark ancestral rites, to celebrate seasonal changes, to name children with meanings that carry echoes of lineage and hope. Names given at birth might differ from those recorded in colonial ledgers. A child registered as Joseph might be called Obasi at home. A woman baptized as Marie still pours libations to her foremothers. Identity becomes fluid, shaped by place, audience, and survival. In the fields, farmers adapt to shifting demands. Some grow the mandated cash crops, cotton, groundnuts, coffee, to meet quotas or taxes. Others hide food plots deep in the forest, growing yams, cassava, or sorghum in secret to feed their families. Agricultural agents patrol the countryside, issuing fines or praising compliance depending on their temperament or bribe. In mining regions, labour migration becomes a way of life. Young men leave for months or years, working in compounds under strict rules, returning with wages, goods, and stories. In their absence, women manage farms, raise children, and maintain community rituals. Some scholars have noted how colonial economies, often seen as male-driven, relied heavily on female labour and organisation at the village level. Without fanfare, women hold much of society together. Housing styles shift slowly. In urban centres, colonial architecture appears. Bungalows with tin roofs, compounds laid out in orderly rows. In segregated zones, Africans are housed in cramped quarters, often without sanitation, under curfews and surveillance. But in rural areas, traditional homes still dominate. Mud walls, thatched roofs, compounds organised by lineage. Even in cities, residents decorate interiors with mats, carvings, and symbols that reflect their origins. Food is cooked with local spices, music played on local instruments, dances performed after dusk in the privacy of courtyards. The colonial city tries to impose order, but cannot erase culture. In fact, it often accelerates its transformation, giving rise to new forms, hybrid clothing styles, new musical genres, written literature in African languages using Roman script. The city becomes a crucible, not just of control, but of creativity. In towns, new professions emerge: barbers, tailors, teachers, drivers, typists. Some gain modest incomes, others scrape by. Trade unions form, organising around wages, conditions, and respect. Newspapers begin to appear, some official, others underground. They publish poetry, editorials, announcements, and critiques, sometimes in code. A short article about potholes might actually speak of colonial neglect. A poem about rain may contain metaphors of resistance. The line between art and politics begins to blur. Leisure, too, takes on new shapes. Football spreads across the continent, introduced in mission schools and military posts. Young men play in open fields, watched by friends and elders. Teams form, rivalries build, victories are celebrated with songs and dance. Some colonial officials encourage the sport, hoping it will instill discipline. Others grow uneasy when crowds gather. A match, after all, can become more than a game. In beer halls, men gather to talk, joke, argue. Some are watched. Others are ignored. In dance halls, guitars and drums mix with European instruments. A new sound emerges. High life, sukus, marabi. The empire's reach cannot silence rhythm. In fact, it often amplifies it, giving rise to forms that transcend borders. All the while, silence lives in the margins. The silence of loss, of land taken, languages fading, elders dying without heirs to their stories. The silence of compromise, of customs abandoned quietly to avoid punishment. And yet, these silences are not empty. They are filled with listening, remembering, waiting. A grandmother who never learned to read tells her grandson a story from before the roads came. A man whose father fought in a colonial war lights a candle and does not speak of it. A girl stands at the edge of a field, watching planes overhead, wondering if her future will look like the world they promise, or the world they have taken. As the decades pass, something begins to stir beneath the surface of colonial order. A quiet reawakening, not sudden, not uniform, but persistent. In towns and mission schools, in courtrooms and fields, African voices begin to rise, first in whispers, then in print, then in public protest. They speak in many languages, under many banners, with differing visions, but they share a deep insistence that their futures must not be decided without them. The foundations of resistance had never vanished, only adapted. Now they take new forms, lawyers challenging unjust decrees, teachers writing essays in local newspapers, workers organising strikes not just for wages but for dignity. In Lagos, Accra, Dakar, Nairobi and beyond, an African intelligentsia emerges, shaped by both traditional values and colonial education. These men and women write letters, form associations, circulate petitions. They are clerks by day, poets by night. Some speak in the language of liberty, others of religion, socialism, or race pride. Their tone is rarely angry. More often it is measured, strategic, insistent. They quote European philosophers and African proverbs, building bridges between worlds that empire had sought to separate. In the early 20th century, newspapers become crucial tools of communication. Periodicals like the West African Pilot, Abantu Baho, and La Voix du Dahomey offer space for reflection, satire, criticism. Through these papers, ideas circulate far beyond their point of origin. A speech in Kampala is read in Freetown. A poem from Nairobi reaches students in Antananarivo. Even colonial censors cannot fully contain the flow. In the churches, pastors begin to preach autonomy, not only of the soul but of the congregation. Independent African churches break away from mission structures, asserting their right to interpret scripture through their own lens. Prophets and spiritual leaders speak not just of salvation, but of justice. In schools, students question the curricula. Why is African history absent? Why must they study the kings of Europe but not their own ancestors? Teachers are often caught in between, required to enforce the colonial syllabus, yet quietly encouraging students to think beyond its limits. Labour becomes another crucible of awakening. As colonial economies expand, so too do the ranks of workers, miners, railwaymen, clerks, dockhands. Conditions are harsh, pay is low, hours long. In response, labour unions begin to form. At first, they focus on practical matters, wages, hours, safety. But soon, their demands grow broader. A strike over food rations becomes a protest over racial hierarchy. A demand for fair treatment becomes a challenge to colonial authority itself. In 1945, a general strike in Nigeria paralyses the economy for weeks. In Senegal, railway workers organise under Amadou Ba and others. negotiating not just with employers but with the colonial state. These movements are not without risks. Leaders are jailed, unions are banned. Still, the momentum builds. Ideas of Pan-Africanism spread, carried by travellers, sailors and students who journey between African ports, the Caribbean, Europe and the Americas. In London and Paris, African intellectuals meet to discuss the future of their homelands. Figures like Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah and Nnamdi Azikiwe spend years abroad, studying, organising, writing. They read W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, correspond with Gandhi, and return home with sharpened visions. In South Africa, the African National Congress is founded in 1912, seeking initially to work within the system, but increasingly aware that the system itself is the problem. Meanwhile, poets and novelists begin to craft a new African literature, grounded in experience, resistant to stereotype. They write of longing, injustice, memory. Their stories are published, circulated, discussed. A generation learns to see itself not as subject but as citizen. Still, colonial authorities remain slow to listen. Reforms are made, but often only cosmetic. A council seat here, a consultation there. Behind the gestures lies a refusal to yield real power. The assumption remains that African voices are not ready, not mature, not yet capable of self-rule. This paternalism is met with growing frustration. One quiet irony is that the very tools used to govern, literacy, urbanization, legal training, now enable resistance. A man educated in British law cites it to challenge his arrest. A woman denied land writes an appeal that makes its way to the governor's desk. A student recites the Declaration of the Rights of Man and asks why it does not apply to her village. The home becomes a space of political awakening. In the evenings, families gather to discuss not only the events of the day, but the currents sweeping through their towns. Radios, once rare, become more common. A voice from Accra might reach a household in Lomé. Speeches are recorded, replayed, memorized. Songs circulate with coded messages. Even lullabies carry new meanings. Grandmothers tell stories of ancestors who resisted, now understood not just as legends but as precedents. And yet the path forward is not unified. Within the rising voices are disagreements about methods, goals, identity. Should change come through negotiation or protest? Through cultural revival or political reform? Should unity be built around ethnicity, religion, class, or nation? Some call for complete independence, others seek gradual transition. There are rivalries, schisms, competing visions. But the fact of disagreement signals something deeper, a new political consciousness, no longer content to be spoken for. In some places, colonial governments respond with councils and commissions, inviting a handful of African representatives into carefully managed discussions. In others, repression intensifies, surveillance, censorship, arrests. The police are called not just to enforce taxes but to break up meetings, confiscate leaflets, silence voices. Some leaders go underground, others work through the courts, still others flee, organizing in exile. But the ideas cannot be exiled. They have taken root. In a classroom in Dakar, a child writes an essay about freedom. In a church in Lusaka, a sermon speaks of a promised land not far away, but right here. In a market in Abidjan, a woman refuses to pay a new fee, saying simply, "We're tired." Tired, but not defeated. Across the continent, a sense of possibility begins to flicker. Not yet certain, not yet victorious, but undeniable. It travels in paper and memory, in chant and song, in protest and prayer. A colonial officer may write that all is calm, that the colony is productive, peaceful. But beneath the lines of his report, the earth trembles softly with footsteps toward change. When the First World War erupts in Europe in 1914, it arrives in Africa not with a declaration, but with requisitions, movements, and commands that ripple outward from colonial capitals to distant villages and quiet fields. Few Africans understand the cause of the war, fewer still are consulted, yet the conflict reaches them all the same. The continent becomes both battlefield and resource, its people drawn into a war not their own, its lands transformed by strategies mapped in London, Paris and Berlin. Colonies held by Germany, Togoland, Cameroon, German East Africa, German Southwest Africa, become immediate targets for Allied powers. British and French forces mobilise swiftly, seeking to seize these territories before they can fortify. African soldiers are conscripted, some recruited through promises, others coerced. Alongside them march porters, hundreds of thousands of men and boys carrying food, ammunition, medical supplies, and the burden of empire on their shoulders. In German East Africa, the conflict stretches on for years as General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck leads a guerrilla campaign that ties down Allied forces far from Europe. The campaign spans mountains, lakes and forests, devastating local communities as both sides requisition food and labour. Villages are emptied, crops burned, disease spreads. Some estimates place the death toll of African carriers in the hundreds of thousands, many buried where they fell, their names unrecorded. Elsewhere, soldiers from Senegal, Nigeria, Kenya, the Gold Coast and other colonies are shipped to fight in Europe, the Middle East and Asia. They wear uniforms stitched in factories they have never seen, carry rifles stamped with foreign crests, and follow orders given in unfamiliar tongues. In the trenches of France, West African tirailleurs endure cold, mud, and the indifference of allies who see them as expendable. Letters home, if they arrive, are censored. News of their sacrifice spreads slowly. For many, the war is a confusing blur, a march across lands that blur into one another, an order to fire at strangers, a name etched on a stone in a country they will never visit again. Yet for others, the war becomes a moment of transformation. Men who had never left their regions see new worlds, learn new skills, form new bonds. They return with memories that do not fit neatly into the colonial narrative. They have seen the metropole not as legend, but as reality. Flawed, complex, vulnerable. The war demands resources as much as lives. Colonial administrations increase taxes, seize crops, and commandeer transport. In British Nigeria, the war tax sparks protests. In French West Africa, forced labour intensifies to meet quotas for rubber, cotton and food. Famine follows in some regions. Livestock is requisitioned, markets collapse, and traditional economies buckle under the weight of wartime demand. Colonial officers speak of loyalty, of subjects doing their duty for the empire. But many Africans feel the weight of sacrifice without recognition. They watch as their sons are sent to distant wars, their food taken for distant armies, and they begin to ask quietly, what is loyalty worth? Still, responses vary. In some places, chiefs rally their people in support of the war effort, believing it will earn favour or protect their autonomy. In others, resistance simmers. Rebellions break out, small and large, against conscription, taxation and abuse. In Malawi, the Chilembwe uprising of 1915 becomes a powerful symbol of spiritual and political resistance. John Chilembwe, a pastor educated in the United States, preaches against injustice and leads a short-lived rebellion against British rule. He is killed, his movement suppressed, but his message lives on. That dignity cannot be denied forever. His portrait will one day appear on national currency, a quiet reminder of a man who dared to dream beyond the limits imposed on him. One quiet debate lingers among scholars. Did the First World War mark a turning point in African consciousness, a shift from submission to political awakening? Some argue it did, citing the return of veterans who spread new ideas. Others say the change was slower, the result of many pressures converging. But most agree that the war unsettled the colonial order. It revealed its fragility, its dependence, its contradictions. It opened cracks through which new ideas could pass. After the war, the League of Nations is formed, and former German colonies are placed under mandate systems, ostensibly to be governed in trust until they are ready for self-rule. In practice, these mandates change little. They shift control from one colonial power to another, replacing flags but not structures. Tanganyika moves from German to British hands. Togoland is split between France and Britain. Cameroon too is divided. The language of trusteeship masks the continuity of control. Independence is promised, vaguely someday, but never defined. In Europe, monuments rise to honour the fallen. Names are carved in stone. In Africa, many who served are forgotten. A few receive medals or pensions, most do not. They return to villages altered by absence, bearing wounds both visible and hidden. Some speak of their experiences, others remain silent. The memory of the war lives not in official histories but in family stories, songs, and the quiet glance of a father who remembers marching in a foreign land. In colonial schools, the war is taught as a triumph of European valour. The African role is mentioned only in passing, if at all. And yet, something has changed. A generation has crossed boundaries once thought fixed. They have seen the empires at war with themselves. They have served loyally and been overlooked. They have carried rifles and carried stretchers, and now they carry questions. In the towns, veterans begin to meet, to talk, to organise, to write. In churches, sermons begin to carry a sharper tone. In newspapers, editorials ask what the empire owes its subjects. The war, though distant in its origin, has come home. Everywhere the landscape bears marks of the conflict. Memorial crosses, abandoned camps, railway sidings built to move goods more quickly. In gardens, poppies bloom without meaning, unrecognised. In memories, the war lives on, not as glory but as a lesson that empires need their colonies, that sacrifice does not guarantee respect, and that the next struggle will not be fought for others, but for the right to speak, to decide, to belong. In the years between the wars, the colonial world settles into a brittle calm, its structures repaired, its policies refined, but its foundation increasingly strained. The old rhythms of conquest and consolidation give way to management, to optimization, to the daily maintenance of empire. New roads are built, not for liberation, but for the faster transport of goods. Schools expand, but only to produce more clerks, more teachers, more functionaries fluent in the grammar of foreign rule. The illusion of permanence deepens, flags flutter, ledgers fill, trains arrive on schedule. But beneath the surface, change stirs like wind through tall grass. Across Africa, the interwar decades become a time of deepening complexity. Colonial systems grow more confident, more elaborate, yet the cracks grow wider. In cities, urban life expands. New neighbourhoods rise along railway lines and port edges, filled with workers, traders, artisans and migrants seeking opportunity or fleeing rural hardship. The city becomes a place of tension, overcrowded, policed, but also alive with energy. Newspapers are sold on corners, sermons echo from churches, and at night music drifts from dance halls where guitars and drums speak of longing, laughter, and loss. In these spaces, new ideas find fertile ground. Trade unions, cultural clubs, mutual aid societies, and literary circles take root, often framed as apolitical but carrying political potential. They organise dances, publish newsletters, provide burial funds, but also nurture debate, sharpen language, and build networks of solidarity. Women's associations begin to speak, quietly at first, about market rights, food prices, and fairness. In Lagos, Accra, and Freetown, newspapers take on bolder tones, challenging colonial policy with editorials penned by Africans who now know the machinery of empire from the inside. They are not revolutionaries, not yet, but they are watching, writing, remembering. In rural areas, the impact of colonial policies deepens. Land alienation continues, especially in settler colonies where Europeans claim large tracts for agriculture, pushing African communities into reserves or marginal soils. In Kenya, southern Rhodesia and Algeria, settler populations grow, and with them the demand for cheap African labour. Pass laws, curfews and work permits become tools of control. Chiefs are pressured to deliver labour quotas. Resistance remains, often unrecorded. A field planted with forbidden crops, a family refusing to move, a prayer offered in defiance. In French West Africa, the Indigena Code remains in force, a legal regime that grants colonial administrators the power to arrest, punish, and fine African subjects without trial. Despite the promises of assimilation, citizenship remains elusive. A few elite Africans navigate the maze, earning limited rights through education, military service, or loyalty. Most remain subject to arbitrary rule, and yet the colonial project is not seamless. Administrations struggle with budgets, geography, disease, and descent. Epidemics sweep through urban quarters. Locusts destroy harvests. Famines recur. In some areas, the Great Depression of the 1930s brings sharp declines in commodity prices. Cocoa farmers in Ghana, peanut producers in Senegal, cotton growers in Uganda all feel the shock. Colonial revenues fall, services are cut, taxes are raised, protests flare. In the Gold Coast, farmers boycott foreign companies. In Nigeria, market women strike against price controls. The colonial economy, always fragile, begins to show strain. One quiet irony lies in the way colonial education, designed to produce obedience, begins to produce critique. A student in a mission school learns about the French Revolution, then wonders why liberty and fraternity do not apply to his village. A clerk filing land records notices the names of dispossessed families. A teacher assigned to instruct in English begins to write poetry in Shona or Yu. Knowledge spreads unevenly, but it spreads. African voices find new channels: journals, pamphlets, sermons, songs. In South Africa, a new generation of thinkers emerges, confronting not only colonial rule but the racial architecture that underpins it. The African National Congress begins to evolve, reaching beyond its early petitions to organise more widely. In West Africa, political movements form, led by teachers, lawyers, journalists. Men and women whose exposure to Europe's ideals has sharpened their critique of its realities. Some colonial officials respond with alarm. Intelligence files grow thicker. Surveillance expands. Meetings are monitored. But repression cannot erase memory. It cannot erase the experience of war, of labour, of land lost. In families across the continent, stories are passed on, of times before the railway, before the taxes, before the chiefs were chosen by outsiders. These stories are not just nostalgia, they are frameworks for imagining something different. Spiritual movements continue to rise. In southern Nigeria, the Aladura churches blend Christian liturgy with African prophecy, attracting thousands. In Congo, the Kimbanguist movement challenges both colonial authority and mission orthodoxy, insisting on healing, visions, and African leadership. These are not merely religious expressions, they're assertions of dignity, ownership, and belief outside colonial control. To the administrators they are subversive, to the faithful they are truth. Meanwhile, the international world begins to shift. In the Caribbean and the United States, black intellectuals speak of Pan-African unity, of shared struggle across oceans. In Paris and London, students from Africa, the West Indies, and the Americas gather in cafes and lecture halls, debating empire, socialism, and culture. The negritude movement emerges, celebrating black identity and resisting colonial definitions. Its poetry crosses borders, entering classrooms and drawing rooms back home. In some places, local elections are introduced, tightly controlled, limited in scope, but real enough to open political space. Candidates campaign, voters debate. A poster pasted to a wall invites discussion. A village hears its name mentioned in a capital city. It is not yet power, but it is a beginning. The idea of citizenship, long withheld, becomes a question no longer whispered but asked aloud. Still, colonial rule remains intact. Roads are repaired, laws are enforced, governors issue proclamations, but the ground beneath them is shifting. A generation grows up that has never known a world without empire, yet begins to imagine one. They are not unified. They are Igbo and Oromo, Wolof and Shona, Catholic and Muslim, peasant and elite, but they are connected by a shared sense that something is out of balance. A whisper passes through schools and streets, churches and fields. The future cannot look like the past. In these years between wars, Africa watches, waits, prepares. Its people learn to speak in many voices, to navigate many systems, to endure and imagine. The empire believes it has time, that its rule is secure. But the time it counts is not the same time kept by those who live beneath its gaze. The sun still rises over markets and mosques, over fields and factories, and with it rises a generation that sees both the weight of history and the outline of change. When the Second World War begins in 1939, it spreads like a widening ripple, engulfing not only Europe but the colonies that feed, fund, and fortify it. Africa once again is drawn into a global conflict it did not cause but must carry. Soldiers are summoned, porters conscripted, resources seized. From the deserts of North Africa to the forests of East Africa, battles are fought on African soil, but also across seas, where African troops are sent to Italy, Burma, and the Middle East. They fight in foreign uniforms under foreign flags, with promises of respect and reward that often remain unfulfilled. In British colonies, tens of thousands enlist or are recruited, some by choice, many through pressure or need. In French territories, the Free French and Vichy regimes compete for allegiance, pulling Africans into opposing camps. In Algeria, Tunisia and Morocco, North African troops fight for a France that classifies them as second-class citizens. In Belgian and Portuguese colonies, soldiers are dispatched without fanfare, expected to serve without recognition. On the ground, the war accelerates the movement of people, ideas and goods. Military roads are built, airstrips carved from savannas, ports expanded. Wartime necessity opened spaces that peacetime bureaucracy had closed. Men and women move between towns and regions, encountering new dialects, new cultures, new ways of seeing. In the barracks, soldiers exchange stories not just of battle, but of home, of chiefs replaced by colonial officers, of taxes that empty granaries, of children denied schooling. the shared experience of service begins to shift awareness. A man who has marched through Cairo or Bombay may return with questions about why he cannot vote in his own land. A woman who has worked in a military factory may wonder why her labour is invisible. At home, the war brings hardship. Prices rise, wages stagnate, and basic goods become scarce. Colonial administrations demand increased production: rubber, tin, copper, groundnuts, palm oil, all for the war effort. In the Belgian Congo, uranium mined from Shinkolobwe is shipped abroad in secret, later used in the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. In Nigeria, farmers are forced to sell cocoa at fixed prices far below market value. In Senegal and Madagascar, rice shortages grow acute. Urban workers strike. Women protest in markets. The promise of shared sacrifice is met with unequal burden. Yet amid these pressures, organizational capacity grows. Unions become more skilled, publications more pointed, leaders more connected. A quiet infrastructure of resistance begins to form beneath the machinery of war. Cultural life too shifts under wartime strain. Films are shown in village halls, often as propaganda but interpreted with wit. Soldiers returning from abroad bring back music, clothing, languages. In Lagos and Kinshasa, dance halls swell with new rhythms, swing, rumba, jazz, echoing a world in motion. Photographs of soldiers in uniform circulate, symbols of pride and proof of service. In some regions, the church becomes a platform for dissent, with sermons veiled in parable and prayer offered not just for peace, but for justice. Schools remain tools of control, but also of preparation. A generation of students learns to read between the lines. Toward the end of the war, political movements once tentative grow bolder. In 1944, the Brazzaville Conference is convened by Free French authorities to discuss reform in the colonies. It promises change, more rights, more representation, but stops short of endorsing independence. Still, its language marks a shift. The idea that colonial subjects might one day be citizens is no longer dismissed outright. In British territories, constitutional reforms are proposed, expanding advisory councils, permitting limited elections. These gestures are real, but partial. They are offered not as surrender, but as strategy, a way to maintain control while channeling pressure. Yet the pressure only grows. Veterans return home to find that little has changed. Promises made during recruitment of pensions, land, dignity are often broken. In Accra in 1948, a protest by ex-servicemen turns deadly when colonial police open fire. Riots follow, shops burn, protest spreads. A young Kwame Nkrumah, recently returned from the United States, steps into the spotlight, calling for immediate self-rule. In Kenya, discontent simmers among landless peasants and disenfranchised youth. In Algeria, resentment builds after the massacre at Sétif, where a peaceful protest is met with brutal repression. Across the continent, the war has opened a door that will not close. There remains a debate among historians. Did the Second World War make decolonization inevitable, or did it merely accelerate existing movements? Some argue that the war weakened colonial powers economically and morally, exposing their dependence on African labour and loyalty. Others point to the broader currents of nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and global realignment that were already underway. Most agree, however, that the war altered the tone. The moral language used to justify the war, freedom, democracy, justice, returns to the colonies as a demand. If Europe could fight a war to end tyranny, why should it continue to impose rule without consent? At the same time, the post-war world changes. The United Nations is formed, declaring the right to self-determination. New global powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, view colonialism with suspicion or strategic concern. International attention begins to focus on empire not as natural, but as a problem to be solved. African leaders attend conferences, publish manifestos, build alliances across borders. They no longer ask politely, they organize, assert, prepare. Within colonial administrations, uncertainty grows. Some officials advocate reform, fearing unrest. Others tighten control. Files grow thicker, meetings multiply. But the assumptions that once held empire together, of permanence, of superiority, of inevitability, begin to falter. Even in remote outposts, the mood shifts. A young teacher speaks of independence to his students. A civil servant files a report with words chosen carefully. A village elder blesses a grandson, not with submission but with hope. The war ends in 1945, but its echoes stretch far beyond the battlefield. The soldiers return, the banners fall, the guns fall silent. But in Africa something else has begun. Not a war, not a revolution, but a gathering wind, steady and rising. The empires still stand, but their foundations now rest on sand. And the people who once marched under foreign flags begin to prepare to march for themselves. In the years after the war, the world enters a new era, and so does Africa. The old certainties of empire weaken beneath the weight of new realities. Colonial powers emerge from the war financially strained, politically shaken, and increasingly out of step with a global order that now speaks of rights, freedom, and equality. Across Africa, these words are not abstractions. They are demands. The road to independence does not appear all at once, nor does it unfold the same way everywhere. In some places it is slow and negotiated, in others swift and stormed. But the direction is clear, and it is away from foreign rule. In the Gold Coast, the colony that will become Ghana, change begins to move quickly. Kwame Nkrumah returns from years abroad and becomes the voice of a generation. Charismatic, strategic, and tireless, he organises rallies, founds newspapers, and builds alliances across class and region. In 1949, he forms the Convention People's Party and begins to demand not incremental reform, but immediate self-government. His message resonates, not only with elites, but with farmers, market women, and workers who had long borne the burdens of colonial policy. In 1950, the CPP calls for positive action, strikes, protests, civil disobedience. Nkrumah is arrested, but the movement grows. By 1951, elections are held, and the imprisoned Nkrumah wins overwhelmingly. 5 years later, he becomes Prime Minister. In 1957, the Gold Coast becomes Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence. Celebrations ring through Accra, through markets, through villages. Drums are played, flags raised, names of ancestors remembered. It is not just a national victory, but a continental signal. The road can be walked. In North Africa, the struggle is already underway. Egypt, technically independent since 1922, remains under strong British influence. In 1952, a group of army officers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrows the monarchy. In 1956, Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, defying Britain and France, igniting a crisis that ends with imperial powers humiliated and retreating under global pressure. Egypt becomes a symbol of sovereignty, of strength, of an Africa beginning to speak for itself. Further west, in Algeria, the path is bloodier. A long history of French settler dominance and political exclusion breeds deep resentment. In 1954, the National Liberation Front, FLN, launches a coordinated campaign against French rule. The Algerian War becomes one of the most brutal in the decolonization period. Villages destroyed, civilians tortured, cities locked in fear. France responds with overwhelming force, but the resolve of the Algerian people holds. After 8 years, in 1962, Algeria gains independence, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. The trauma lingers, but so does the victory. Elsewhere, the road is uneven. In French West Africa, leaders like Félix Houphouët-Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire and Léopold Sédar Senghor in Senegal pursue a more cautious path. They negotiate, serve in French institutions, and eventually secure independence through constitutional reforms. In 1960 alone, 17 African countries become independent. That year is remembered as the Year of Africa, a tidal wave of sovereignty washing over a continent long denied its voice. Flags change, national anthems are composed, new currencies minted. But independence is not only ceremony, it is a reshaping of governance, education, identity. Ministries are created, constitutions written, borders reaffirmed, many of them drawn decades earlier by foreign hands, now inherited as fragile lines of statehood. In some regions the handover is peaceful, even celebratory. In others, it is contested, rushed, or undermined. In the Congo, Belgium grants independence in 1960 with little preparation. The result is chaos, mutinies, secessions, assassinations. Patrice Lumumba, the newly elected Prime Minister, is ousted and killed with foreign complicity. His death becomes a symbol of what is at stake, that freedom, once gained, must also be defended. In Nigeria, independence comes in 1960 after long negotiation. A federal system is established, elections held, a new flag flown. But ethnic and regional tensions simmer beneath the surface, unresolved, complicated by colonial legacies and political rivalry. Across the continent, former freedom fighters become heads of state. Their visions are varied: socialist, capitalist, Pan-Africanist, nationalist. Some emphasize unity, others pluralism. Some embrace traditional culture, others look to modernity. A quiet tension emerges between the dreams of liberation and the realities of governance. The inherited colonial structures, borders, languages, legal systems, remain not because they were loved, but because they are hard to replace. New governments face immense challenges: poverty, illiteracy, lack of infrastructure, fractured societies. Foreign powers remain present, now as partners, donors, and sometimes manipulators. The Cold War adds complexity, as the United States and the Soviet Union vie for influence, offering aid and ideology in equal measure. Still, for many, these early years of independence are marked by hope. Universities are built, newspapers flourish, artists create with renewed purpose. In music, dance, literature, and fashion, a cultural renaissance blossoms. Writers like Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Wole Soyinka gain global recognition, challenging narratives that had long silenced African perspectives. Across villages and cities, people speak of the future with pride, not as something distant, but as something now in their hands. Yet beneath the euphoria, difficulties gather. In some states, one-party rule is established in the name of unity. In others, military coups erupt, often justified as necessary correctives. Economic dependence remains deep. Commodity prices fluctuate, loans are taken. Corruption begins to poison public trust. Some leaders hold power too long. Others are removed before their visions can take root. The dream of independence is not broken, but it is tested. And still, the road is walked. One step, then another. A child born in 1960 grows up hearing her country's anthem at school, reading its history in books no longer written by colonizers, imagining a life not framed by subjugation, but by choice. The colonial era is ending, but its legacy remains. In language, in law, in landscape. The generation that fought for freedom begins to pass on its memories, its regrets, and its hopes to those who must build something lasting from the fragments left behind. The age of colonial rule in Africa comes to a close not with a single moment, but with a long, uneven exhalation, a release that stretches across decades, across borders, across lives shaped by struggle, memory, and unfinished dreams. As the last colonial flags are lowered, one after another, in capitals from Lusaka to Maputo, the silence they leave behind is not peace, but the breath between eras. Independence does not arrive as resolution. It arrives as a beginning laden with contradictions. In some countries it brings jubilation, drums beat into the night, names of ancestors are spoken in victory, streets fill with people who had long been told to remain invisible. In others it arrives through weary negotiation, after wars too long, losses too deep, and silence too enforced. Still others see independence emerge from ashes, civil war, collapse, or compromise that leaves questions unanswered. The era ends, but it does not conclude neatly. In the Portuguese colonies, the final unravelling comes late. While much of Africa has already taken its first steps toward post-colonial life, Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau remain under firm Portuguese rule well into the 1970s. Their resistance movements, MPLA, Frelimo, PIGC, fight for years in armed struggle, drawing on Marxist ideology, Cold War alliances, and the will of those who refuse to live under a system that denies their very names. In Guinea-Bissau, Amilcar Cabral becomes both warrior and philosopher, a leader who speaks of liberation not only as political necessity, but as cultural renewal. He's assassinated before independence is achieved, but his ideas endure. In 1974, a military coup in Portugal brings down the regime. The colonies are granted independence almost at once, not from victory in Lisbon, but from exhaustion. Angola and Mozambique become sovereign nations, but fall quickly into civil wars, conflicts shaped as much by Cold War geopolitics as by colonial legacies left unresolved. In southern Africa, the final battles of decolonization take on a sharper edge. Rhodesia, governed by a white minority that declares unilateral independence in 1965, resists majority rule for over a decade. A guerrilla war unfolds, brutal and relentless. Villages are targeted, camps are bombed, and generations grow up with rifles nearby. In 1980, the country becomes Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe, once a teacher imprisoned for his politics, becomes prime minister. There are cheers in Harare, songs sung in Shona and Ndebele, hopes rising from weary hearts. South Africa, last of all, lingers under the heavy weight of apartheid, a system not of colony and metropole, but of internalized domination. The National Party enshrines racial segregation in law, creating a country where the majority is ruled by the few. The resistance is long, complex, often fractured. Protests are met with bullets. Leaders are exiled or jailed, and yet the struggle continues. Students march in Soweto. Unions strike. Artists resist with words and dance and paint. In 1990, Nelson Mandela is released after 27 years in prison. In 1994, South Africa holds its first democratic election. Lines stretch for miles. People vote for the first time in their lives. The colonial chapter, long delayed, is finally closed. And still, the legacy remains. Borders, drawn in European halls, remain largely intact, cutting through cultures, bisecting rivers, linking regions with little in common but the accident of imperial design. Languages imposed by colonial rule, English, French, Portuguese, become national languages, not always by choice, but by necessity. Legal systems carry clauses that echo their colonial predecessors. Education curricula must be rewritten. In some cases, they are. In others, colonial narratives linger in new voices. The cities built as outposts of control become centres of governance, capitals where independence is declared, but also where inequalities persist. The rural-urban divide deepens. The economies that once exported raw materials to feed foreign industries still do. The terms have changed. The power has shifted, but the global structure remains familiar. There are quiet debates in classrooms and homes about what it means to be truly free. Is freedom the absence of foreign rule, or the presence of justice? Is independence a date on a calendar, or the ability to speak, learn, and dream without fear? For some, the post-colonial period becomes a time of disillusionment. Corruption spreads. Leaders who once fought for liberation now cling to power. Elections are held but lack meaning. Coups replace cabinets. In some countries, foreign aid becomes a new chain, conditional, selective, political. In others, multinational corporations hold more power than parliaments, and yet this is not the full story. Alongside these struggles, there are moments of brilliance. New constitutions are written, music travels the world, artists, scholars, and visionaries shape the global imagination. African literature speaks in tones both angry and tender, reclaiming language and land. Nobel Prizes are won. Movements are born. The story continues. The generation that lived under colonial rule grows old. Some remember the sound of marching boots. Others recall the taste of forced labour, the sting of punishment for speaking a banned language, the strange discomfort of learning to read in a tongue not their own. They pass these memories on, in stories, in songs, in the quiet instructions given to grandchildren. Remember who you are. Remember where we came from. Some are proud, some are tired, all have endured. A new generation is born, one that has never known direct colonial rule. Their questions are different. Their references are global, but the soil they walk on still carries the marks of history. A rail line that leads nowhere, a courthouse built in European style, a field where ancestors once gathered but no plaque remains. Memory is not just what is told, it is also what is felt. Africa in the aftermath of empire is not a single thing. It is joy and struggle, loss and creation, inheritance and invention. It is shaped by what came before but not defined by it. The colonial era ends not in erasure, but in continuation. Its echoes still audible, but no longer the only sound. Across the continent, people live, move, build, remember. A woman plants a tree where her village once resisted. A teacher writes a lesson that begins not with European kings, but with the kingdoms of Mali and Great Zimbabwe. A child learns to say their name with pride in a language once forbidden. The footsteps that once approached as conquest now echo behind, growing fainter with each passing season. What remains is the land, the people, and the future they will write. Now the winds are still. The stories have been spoken softly and in full like footsteps fading across a long and quiet plain. The era of colonial rule, once wrapped in paper treaties, iron railways, and flags stitched in distant capitals, lies behind like a trail left in dust, present but no longer defining. Across the continent, night has fallen, fires are low, markets are closed, roads lie quiet beneath the moon. In the north, the sands of the Sahara shift, the same way they have for 1,000 years. In the south, the baobab trees stand tall and watchful, their roots curl deep into memory. Rivers continue their slow journey to the sea, passing fields now sown with tomorrow's grain, past the echoes of labour once coerced, now quieted, villages that once whispered resistance now speak of resilience. From the highlands of Ethiopia to the deltas of the Niger, the language of empire no longer commands but lingers, a shadow stretched thin at sunrise. Children sleep in homes their ancestors once built with earth and hand. Elders sit beside doorways, remembering not just what was lost, but what was kept. The songs still carry, softer now. The books are written in new hands. The names once crossed out have been spoken again. Time moves without rush. There is no need to summarize, no need to explain. What mattered was told, and what remains will endure. In soil, in silence, in the long breath of a continent reclaiming its shape beneath the stars.